Okay, so in today's episode, we're going to try and explain how political changes in the period from 1900 to the present led to territorial, demographic, and nationalist developments, particularly the creation of new ethnocentric states and how competing nationalisms often went poorly. We're also going to dig into the economic changes that resulted from these developments. In the last episode, the emergence of the decolonization movement after the collapse of the European world system following World War II led to the creation of many new states in the global south, particularly Africa and Asia. These new states faced tremendous challenges, politically, demographically, and economically. And unfortunately, the legacy of imperialism left many of them ill-prepared to handle this all on their own. I'm going to address the partition of India and Pakistan very briefly because we're doing a reading and discussion on it in class. But basically, it will surprise no one to find out that the British Raj undermined the efforts that the syncretic Mughals had created to bring the Muslim and Hindu populations of India together. This was commonly called divide and rule. But the interconnectedness of the two religious groups was evident in the fact that many Hindus and Muslims were neighbors and grew up together. They worked side by side in the British bureaucracy and in the independence movement, as seen here, with Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Mahatma Gandhi. However, as independence grew closer, the leadership of the Indian National Congress, which was majority Hindu, and the All India Muslim League, which, get this, was majority Muslim, started to disagree about the extent to which religion should be incorporated into developing a sense of Indian nationalism. The relationship between Muhammad Ali Jinnah, seen here on the left, and Mahatma Gandhi on the right, disintegrated, and the British just didn't have the energy or the money to invest in trying to patch things up. Things started to escalate as Jinnah called for Direct Action Day on the 24th of August, 1946. It was supposed to be a protest march of Indian Muslims to call for the creation of a separate nation for them, the nation of Pakistan. In Calcutta, things turned violent as Hindu groups tried to barricade the march from certain routes, and the protesters answered with violence, leaving, some say, 1,000 or more people dead. I know here it says 90, but as time went on, the number who died went up. In response to this, the British Foreign Service sent Lord Louis Mountbatten, here he is, to develop a speedy resolution to the problem. He arrived in March, and in June, he said that the British would be gone by August. So from March to August, that's about 5 months of preparation time. The dividing lines between India and Pakistan, well, East and West Pakistan, which East Pakistan is today Bangladesh, were drawn by a guy named Cyril Radcliffe, who later admitted he'd been working with out-of-date census and map materials. Basically, overnight, millions of people needed to relocate because Hindus didn't feel safe or welcome in Muslim areas, and Muslims didn't feel safe or welcome in what was now India. This rushed mass migration was deeply messy. People uprooted their whole lives, and vigilantes chased them on their way out, resulting in possibly millions of deaths. Most estimates put the total who died because of the partition between 500,000 and 1 million people. So to continue talking about highly charged and controversial religious-based nationalism, we also see the creation of Israel in 1948, leading to major population shifts. When Israel is created from the former British Mandate of Palestine, the UN draws a map that divides the mandate into two, technically three, but here we'll talk about two states. Israel and Palestine. Israel is in the blue and Palestine is in the orange color. This map and this plan is pretty ridiculous. John Green, in his crash course on this, makes the dark joke that he doesn't know who looked at this map and was like, yeah, that's totally gonna work. Well, spoiler alert, it doesn't work. Over the course of the British Mandate, Jewish immigration to Palestine had increased, leaving the territory with a population that was about 68% Arab, which included both Muslims and Christians, but majority Muslims, and about 32% Jewish. A large portion of the land had been bought by Jewish immigrants from absentee Ottoman landlords. But most of the farmers were Arabs. So that's how we get the map that you see. They zigzagged all over the place to try and separate out the different groups to create mostly religiously homogenous states for each group. And this is definitely a pseudo-religious nationalism, right? Like, why the Mandate didn't just become one Palestine, a secular nation, home to Arab Muslims and Christians and formerly European Jews, just really didn't cross their mind at the time. So as the date neared for the British to leave, violence between Palestinians and the newly arrived Jews increased, with some vigilante militia groups on both sides escalating tensions. There are a variety of kind of villages being attacked and burned, both Jewish settlements and Arab villages. When, in 1948, Israel declares its independence, neighboring countries like Syria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon all invade. Israel retaliates and is able to settle things to be here. As you can tell from the map, we're going to look at the middle one. A lot of the land that was intended to become the Palestinian state has been captured by the new Israeli state as part of this war. What is left is what becomes the Gaza Strip, and then the West Bank. And the West Bank is annexed by Jordan, so it isn't an independent Palestinian state. Both those Palestinians who had fled their homes during the violence leading up to the Declaration of Independence of Israel and those who fled during the war lost their homes and their property. For Israelis, this is their war of independence. For Palestinians, this is known as the catastrophe. Both groups anchor their identities in this moment. For Israelis, it was a never again moment. Never again would they see enemies in the distance they couldn't protect their people from. Never again would they be unable to defend themselves. For Palestinians, this statelessness defines their experience. They were supposed to have a state. Instead, some live inside Israel as citizens or in some occupied areas like this refugee camp. And they're separated by 70-year-old checkpoints that started out as temporary refugee camps. Others still live in refugee camps in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. Even today, 1.5 million Palestinians live outside of Israel in refugee camps. There are more conflicts in the years from 1948 to the present between Israel and its Arab neighbors that further complicate the Palestinian problem for both Israelis and Palestinians. And both sides have been unwilling to compromise in a way that has produced serious movement towards a solution. As we can see, the creation of new states was sometimes kind of a mess because, as we know, defining what it means to be a nation in terms of who belongs and who doesn't can be tricky. Another challenge faced by newly created states existed in the realm of economics. For many of these regions, coming out of a heavily regulated imperial economy was quite the shock to the system, and typically these new governments attempted to exert more control over their economies to, in their minds, help them along the path to development. In some ways, this is understandable. Because of the old colonial bureaucracies, many nations in the global south had few citizens with managerial or logistical experience. There were few individuals with the capital to start large entrepreneurial efforts, and most of the infrastructure was aimed at exporting raw materials instead of developing a robust and well-rounded modern economy. For these nations, the examples of the Soviet Union and China, with their explosive state-driven industrialization, was a model that their limited expertise could work with. However, by the last third of the 20th century, these state-driven efforts started to fall by the wayside as worldwide organizations like the World Bank, which we'll talk about more in the next unit, aligned them more with the Western capitalist models. One of the final ways that newly independent nations found economic development was through the migration of their citizens to countries that used to colonize them. In this way, we see many Angolans in Portugal, many Indians in the UK, and many North Africans in France. Many of these immigrants were seeking better economic opportunities and often sent money back home. These are called remittances, and they contribute greatly to the economies of developing nations. That's it for today. Please remember to like and subscribe so you never miss anything AP World History.